Good morning. Thank you all for joining us today for the Protected Intersection Design and Checklist training. My name is David Ansbacher. I'm a Transportation Planning Supervisor in the Countywide Planning and Policy Division at Montgomery Planning. It's really exciting to see a great mix of folks here it looks like we have folks from the private sector and the public sector with us, representatives from Montgomery Planning, Montgomery County DOT, Permitting Services, and MDOT, as well as several private firms. So we are here today to talk about protected intersections. As many of you are aware, protected intersections are a way of designing intersections that has become more common in the United States as a means of improving bicycling through intersections. These intersection designs also provide safety benefits for pedestrians and motor vehicle occupants as well, and they are effective because they reduce traffic speeds and conflicts, improve visibility, and separate travel modes through the intersection, among other things. Next slide. So protected intersections are a requirement for conformance with the Bicycle Master Plan and are identified as the default bicycle intersection treatment in the county's new Complete Streets Design Guide. Specifically, development projects are required to construct protected intersections along their frontage when the separated bike lanes, side path or shared use paths, buffered bike lanes, or conventional bike lanes are recommended. Protected intersections are still quite new for designers and for staff, and so there's a varying degree of understanding about how to design them and for us, how to review them. So the intent of this training is to go over the fundamentals of protected intersection design, review how to design them, and to walk through the protected intersection checklist, which will be a required component of site plan and or preliminary plan submittals. We'll talk more about that later. We believe the checklist will save applicants and staff time in reviewing intersection designs overall. But before we start, a few housekeeping items. So first of all, this presentation is being recorded and it will be posted on our webpage shortly after the meeting. So I'll send out a link to the presentation to folks in the next few days. Second, please put all your questions or comments in the chat, and the presenters will respond to the questions if it's relevant as they go through the presentation or at a few designated times during the presentation. And finally, a copy of the protected intersection checklist was included in the meeting invitation, and you can also get it on our webpage, which I'll put in the chat in a moment. Next slide. So we have leading this training today two very accomplished individuals from Tool Design. Jeremy Charzan is Tool Design's multimodal design practice lead. He's a professional engineer with over 23 years of experience in transportation, municipal, and site engineering projects. Beyond his vast design experience, Jeremy is the lead engineer for the forthcoming AASHTO Bike Guide and has been the lead engineer for a variety of other design guidance, including Ohio DOT's Multimodal Design Guide, the Massachusetts DOT's Separated Bike Lane Planning and Design Guide, and numerous FHWA and NCHRP design guidance focused on safety, comfort, and accessibility for people walking and bicycling. Megan McCarty Graham is a senior engineer at Tool Design. She's a licensed professional engineer with 12 years of experience in multimodal transportation projects from concept to final design. As a contributing author of the forthcoming AASHTO Bike Guide, Megan brings a good mix of real-world design experience, knowledge of best practices, and a deep understanding of the user experience. So I will turn it over to Jeremy and Megan now.
Excellent. Thank you, David. And just real quickly, if you're not familiar with Tool Design, we're a multidisciplinary firm focused on planning, engineering, and landscape architecture for projects specifically focused on multimodal transportation and active transportation. So we've been tackling the ideas of protected intersections for quite some time and hope we can impart some of our wisdom from past projects and past research to really elevate the county's approach to protected intersection design. We've basically done projects all across the country and in Canada, so a lot of practical experience went into the development of this checklist for the county. So today we already covered the introductions, but we'll start with just some basic design principles of protected intersections and then walk through how to design protected intersections, followed by some examples of protected intersections that have been previously constructed or are in design. And then after a quick break, we'll walk you through the checklist and really help you to understand how you will use this useful tool on both the design side and making sure that you're meeting all of the county's design guidance for protected intersections. And certainly feel free to put those questions in the chat and we'll try to respond to them in the moment, but we've also reserved some time at the end to respond to any lingering questions that you might have. So to ensure that we're all speaking the same language, the goal at any intersection is to ensure that it's safe and comfortable for all users to navigate that space. And the 4 guiding principles of that goal are to minimize exposure to turning vehicles, so minimize bicyclist and pedestrian exposure, reduce the speeds of all users, but specifically the speeds of turning motor vehicles, clearly communicate who has the right of way at the intersections through signing, marking, signals, all the tools in our toolbox, and then ensure that everybody can see each other so that they can respond accordingly. These are going to be the 4 guiding principles for any intersection, but are extremely relevant for safe and comfortable protected intersection designs. So protected intersections are a tried and true approach to address each and every one of those 4 design concepts that I just mentioned. In addition to that, they're also just generally more intuitive and comfortable for users to navigate, whether that's through reducing the crossing distances for pedestrians or bicyclists, making the bicyclist more visible through queuing spaces, all of these things that we're going to walk through. These are the tried and true reasons why a protected intersection is the safest design for separated bike lanes or really any bike lane approaching an intersection. So as we kind of already said, protected intersections maintain that physical separation that you would have on a normal separated bike lane, maintains that separation all the way up to the intersection to help to address the conflicts between all the different users that are approaching an intersection. And why do we do this? It's because we know that with conventional intersection designs, there are some fundamental flaws that allow drivers to turn quickly, meaning that it will take more time for them to see and react to users at the crossings. And this video, this is not a staged instance. This is something that we looked at as part of a systemic safety project. This location was identified to likely have safety issues, and sure enough, you go out there and you see the types of safety issues that you would expect from a conventional intersection design. By comparison, we know that protected intersections do help to control the speeds of turning motorists and clearly create the spaces and operation that we expect from all the street users to make that intersection more safe. So this is a location from Salt Lake City, and while that white car comes into the intersection really fast, you can see that through the different elements of design, that driver is forced to turn more slowly, and had there been a pedestrian or bicyclist crossing at this instance, they would have had the time to respond to that and stop or yield for those crossing users. So really important to get the geometric elements and functionality out of the intersection that we want to ensure that people can get through those intersections safely. So I'll quickly step you through these elements, though we will do a deeper dive into each of these things as we walk through the checklist. But some of the critical elements are where the number 1 is, that's your corner island. That's the thing that's going to control the speeds of turning motorists. Number 2, that's the advanced queuing space. It means the crossing distance for bicyclists is shorter and that they're more visible when the light turns green to a turning motorist. Number 3 is a space for motorists to yield. Number 4 is an approach clear space that allows users to see each other. Number 5 is a crossing of the bike lane to ensure that pedestrians crossing the bike lane have a clearly defined path. Number 6 is curb ramps, typical for any intersection design. And then 7 and 8 are the actual crossings of the roadway. And one thing to note is the idea of a protected intersection is not necessarily unique to just separated bike lanes. They're also completely applicable to the design of side paths. So you still have all of these same unique design elements of a protected intersection, the queuing space, the corner island to control the speeds. And the only thing that's fundamentally different is that bicyclists and pedestrians cross in the same space rather than in 2 separate spaces. So we need to be thinking about this as we approach any design that involves bikes and pedestrians moving along the street and ensure that we're doing the right thing to get the safety benefits of the protected intersection design. And so as we think about protected intersections, there's really going to be 2 fundamental approaches to make this a success. The first one is the geometric designs, and that's sort of those design elements that I quickly stepped you through, the 1 through 8. That's what's going to create physical separation between a crossing pedestrian and bicyclist and those turning motorists. And these types of designs will be achieved through either quick build with pavement markings and flex posts, or through reconstruction projects or more substantive projects, building curbs and doing some reconstruction at the intersections to create all those fundamental elements. The other way of approaching protected intersections is through signal phasing to essentially provide dedicated times for pedestrians and bicyclists to move through the intersection that's separate from turning vehicle paths. So if you can allow bikes and peds to go and hold back turning motorists, then that fundamentally also creates a protected intersection, achieving each of those 4 fundamental goals that we discussed at the beginning. So now that I've kind of described the lexicon of design elements for protected intersections, does anybody have any basic questions about that we need to address before we move on?
So we've muted everybody, but I don't see any comments in the chat at this time.
Okay, great. Let me turn it over to Megan to take over these next few slides.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. So this next section, we're going to dive a bit deeper into each of the elements that Jeremy just introduced. So if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide. So there are 4 examples in the checklist of different types, different styles, different examples of protected intersections. Here are just 2 of them. And as Jeremy just mentioned, the elements are really similar for side paths and protected bike lanes. So all of these components are fundamentally the same. They're just going to look a little bit different. So we'll walk through each of them in detail. And this, if you just kind of keep looking at. So the first is this corner island. Here in the top image, there's a concrete corner island with a mountable truck apron, which we'll explain in a little bit. And in the bottom image, it's just a space between the 2 curb ramps. The next is a bicycle queuing space, which just provides that forward area where bicyclists can queue. Again, it's the same concept in both of these drawings. The next is the clear distance, or providing space for people to make sure they can see the bicyclist, as they're approaching in the travel lane. Having no trees or parking in that zone is really important. The next is the motorist yield zone, and this provides a little bit more visibility, which Jeremy will show a couple of images later. And then the pedestrian crossing and curb ramps are obviously going to be critical for either of these two styles of protected bike lanes. Protected intersections, I'm sorry. So diving a bit deeper into the corner island, this is really the foundational element of a protected intersection. Without this, you can't really have a protected intersection. This provides physical separation between the bikeway and the motor vehicle travel lanes and physically protects the bicyclist from right turning motor vehicles by providing by creating space for vehicles to wait as they're turning if they are going to encounter a bicyclist. It also, by having this corner island, it creates physical space to provide that forward queuing area that we talked about, which is in that green space for someone to wait in advance of the main stop bar intersection of the intersection. This corner island also helps to reduce the total crossing distance by shifting the bicyclist queuing space or the pedestrian space a little bit further into the roadway so they have a shorter crossing space. This corner island also helps control motorist speeds by typically it has a smaller turning radii than a standard corner radii would, or curb radii. And then there's also an option to include a mountable truck apron on corner islands, which is shown in that top graphic in red or orange, I guess, whatever color that is, which we'll get into in more detail soon. So go ahead to the next. So really, when you're designing this corner island, the goal is to minimize the curb radius. And what we're really doing is designing for a very slow vehicle turn. So often that's under 10 miles an hour. And what we want designers to do is to select the smallest feasible curb radius that you can. And that's going to depend on a couple of factors. Montgomery County already has a standard, but it also is influenced by the number of travel lanes. As you can see here, there's 2 receiving lanes, so there's a little bit more wiggle room for some encroachment into that second lane. The configuration of the travel lanes is going to matter, whether the intersection is skewed, that sort of thing. And then also just the characteristics of your design and control vehicle. So this is a rather large truck we're accommodating, and that's going to impact whether or not we are going to recommend or require a mountable truck apron. So getting into the design and control vehicles a little bit on the next slide. So your design vehicle is going to be the least maneuverable vehicle that is going to routinely use that street. And that's what's going to be used to set the radius of that corner island. So in Montgomery County, the typical standard is a single unit truck with a 42-foot turning radius. And there are some caveats and exceptions that are listed in the Complete Streets Guide and referenced in the checklist. So be sure to, familiarize yourself with the location of that. But for just general purpose, the design vehicle is going to be this SU30. On the next slide, we'll touch on the control vehicle. This is going to be an infrequent user of the street, but it's going to be critical and necessary that this vehicle can maneuver through the intersection that you've designed or created. And this is used to set the radius of the mountable truck apron. And in Montgomery County, the standard control vehicle is the Fire and Rescue Services standard fire truck. So on the next slide, here's an image of mountable truck aprons. It's shown in red or orange. Again, I don't know what color that is. But the key here is that it's visually distinct from the concrete island. And the reason for that is we want to make sure that people are not thinking of this as a typical space to drive, and they're not thinking of it as a pedestrian space to wait, or, we want it to be visually distinct, that it's neither of those things. Typically, the maximum curb reveal is 3 inches, and having this larger radii will reduce some of your bike and ped queuing space. So it's just something to keep in mind of the trade-offs if you're going to provide a really large mountable truck apron. And Jeremy will show an example later of a really large truck apron and some challenges in a real world example. But The goal of this is to reduce speed for passenger vehicles or like your common design vehicle going around the mountable truck apron, but providing space for those larger vehicles to mount up onto the apron and go slowly across without damaging the concrete corner island, basically. In the next slide, it shows an overview of kind of comparing each of the vehicle types. So on the left is a typical passenger car, and as you can see, they're driving around the mountable truck apron. It's very visually distinct. It's not saying, hey, drive here, go around it. But then the truck is able to mount on top of it and drive over it smoothly. The next slide has an example from Australia. You want to go to the next slide? Yeah. This is a little bit different than how we see them in Montgomery County, but it's just similar example and has really similar principles. The reason I wanted to show you this one is it's really clearly visually distinct and clearly delineated. And the other thing is that this curb is not actually like a full radii, it's flat to accommodate a larger truck possibly. So, it doesn't necessarily have to be a full perfect radii. You can have like two smaller. The next slide has an example of a roundabout. And the reason I wanted to show you this is that really these mountable truck aprons are no different than what you would see on an outside truck apron in a roundabout or in the center of a roundabout. And Jeremy actually designed this one in New Jersey. So I don't know if you have anything else to add about it, Jeremy, but or if you don't, that's okay too.
Yeah, I mean, literally, I've been designing outside truck aprons and corner truck aprons for almost 2 decades now. They're not something that's new, but we're basically taking a tool that's been used and sort of applying it to more typical intersection designs to achieve the same safety goals and benefits that we see at roundabouts.
Thanks, Jeremy. All right, so the second element that we will go into more of a deep dive is this bicycle queuing area. So this really provides space for stopping bicyclists to wait in advance of where they would typically wait in a standard intersection. So you can see they're several feet ahead of where the car's stop bar is located or stop line. So they are more visible to the motorist and have sort of an advantage there farther into the intersection that's shortening the crossing, etc. So really this just enables people to be more visible, to have an advanced start and help establish their right of way within the intersection. And where it's feasible or where you think there is going to be a heavier bicycle volume, it is preferable to provide more queuing space. But the minimum is typically the width of the bikeway and then 6.5 feet, which I think is actually on the next slide. So I might be getting ahead of myself here, but you can go to the next one. Yeah. So this bicycle queuing area, as you can see in this image, needs to be fully outside of both the design and control vehicle envelope. So this is really important. If you have a mountable truck apron as part of your design, you're going to want to make sure that your stop line for bicyclists is located behind that to ensure that folks are stopping within the bicycle queuing area and not in the vehicle envelope. The recommended minimum, like I said, is 6.5 feet wide, which is the recommended width of a one-way separated bike lane, and then 6.5 feet deep to provide enough space for a bicycle to queue and allow other bicycle traffic to maneuver behind them. It is optional to add this green colored pavement to visually delineate the space and help just let bicyclists know that this is the place for you to wait.
Yeah, and the only other thing I'd add on that is particularly like in the example shown in the photograph here, the inclusion of that green can help to reinforce to motorists that this isn't the space to turn into. So
right, that this is an
a wayfinding tool for all users.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, and then I think you're taking over from here, Jeremy. You're muted still.
Oh, sorry. Clear space is the space approaching an intersection that should be clear of large obstructions to ensure that motorists and bicyclists can see each other as they're approaching. The provision of this clear space is what's going to allow those users to see each other, recognize which one would reach that conflict point first, and respond accordingly. And this is something we've thought a lot about because it's a very unique sight distance that's specific to separated bike lanes and shared use paths, because you have two users moving in the same direction, but moving at different speeds. So depending on where each user is along their path, that will sort of identify when they would reach the conflict point. And what you're seeing in the image here shows kind of the worst case scenario. What would happen if both users were to arrive at the intersection at the same time? And so the provision of sufficient approach clear space is what ensures that the users have enough time to see each other and then slow or stop as needed to reach that conflict. And so unlike most conventional sight distances where you're assessing a point from a stopped vehicle, in the case of approach clear space, we're providing this guidance based on the radius of your effective turning path at your corner. That then reflects a anticipated vehicle turning speed, which then represents what amount of approach clear space needs to be provided. So in situations, ideally, where you're providing small corner radii, we can assume that the driver is forced to navigate that corner more slowly, and as a result, you need less approach clear space, 20 feet in that instance, to ensure that those two users can see one another. In situations where you're providing larger radii, then we should assume that the motorists can navigate that turn more quickly, and as a result, more approach clear space is needed to ensure that those users will be able to see each other and to respond to one another. And this holds true for both the bicyclist and the pedestrian. So in the example shown on the right, it's actually the motorist that's going to get to the conflict point first. So the provision of sufficient approach clear space ensures that the bicyclist has enough time to see that motorist and slow their speed to allow the motorist to proceed.
Jeremy, we have a question from Rebecca Torma about where do we measure the vehicular clear distance from?
Okay, yeah. So approach clear space is measured from the point of curvature of the turn. So it's at the point where the motorist begins to make their turn around the intersection. That's the starting point of the approach clear space, and you work your way backwards from there. So if this were a 25-foot radius, this is the PC of that turning vehicle path. We would work our way back 50 feet to provide the necessary approach clear space. And it's useful to know that that's the PC of the turning vehicle path. So you might have situations where you have an intersection without the curb bump out and sort of a more conventional corner radius. And so it's not always going to be the PC of the curb. It's going to be the PC of the turning vehicle path. But in most cases with a true protected intersection, you're going to have the corner radius, you're going to have all of these design elements. So it's going to be the PC of the vehicle path is the PC of the curb.
And Jeremy, something that might be important for people to understand here, and I was going to touch on it later, but kind of while we're on this topic, is that that approach clear space is really for them to see each other. It's not necessarily going to perfectly align with any other standard like restricting parking 20 feet or something, you may need to restrict it further to provide approach clear space. So if there's a discrepancy between those two, you would want to make sure that you follow the approach clear space.
Yeah, so approach clear space is one of these things that is identified on the checklist and something that you're going to have to check for each design. One thing that's not included in the checklist, because it's fundamental to all intersection designs, is to still check normal intersection sight distance for motorists who are exiting a side street and turning onto the main line. So the way we typically think of this is that if the main line here is an uncontrolled roadway and this motorist pulls up to this stop bar, they stop at the stop bar, they look for crossing pedestrians. If none are present, they can move forward to the point where they can better see approaching bicyclists. They look for those approaching bicyclists, and if there are none, they can move forward to the point where they can best see approaching motor vehicle traffic. So this is something that's fundamental to all intersection designs. It's just a little different here because you're checking the bikes and then checking the motor vehicles. One thing to note with this is that, as shown, if you're allowing this sort of two-step approach, or really three-step when you consider the pedestrians, then it's very likely that the motorist will either partially or fully block the bike lane. So if you're dealing with situations where the motorist would sit in the bike lane for a long period of time because of the volumes of vehicular traffic, or if you're dealing with locations with very high volumes of bicycle traffic, then it may be appropriate to have that motorist assess sight distance from one spot. The only issue with that is it's going to mean more space that needs to be clear on those approaches, which isn't always going to be practical in a dense urban environment.
Jeremy, Rebecca follows up with, we measure 6 feet back from the stop bar.
Is that in regards to approach clear space or sight distance? Does it say?
It does not say.
Showing my ignorance here, I thought it was 6 feet from the traffic flow line. I'm not sure what you're referring to.
I think they said in sight distance studies.
Perhaps you're referring to just the setback from the adjacent travel lane where the motorist would be assessing that sight line. I've seen 6 feet, I've seen 10 feet, I've seen 15 feet for those sight lines. So if Montgomery County is identifying 6 feet, then that's the point at which you would assess these sight lines. So if you imagine a continuation of this curb line through the intersection, you'd set back 6 feet. So sort of basically the front end of the car is going to be at the edge of travel lane, and the driver's eye is located 6 feet back from the adjacent travel lane. The same thing would hold true for this bike configuration, that you would assume that the motorist is pulling up basically to the face of the curb or edge of the bike lane, looking for approaching bicyclists. If there are none, then advancing forward. And I know we've talked a lot about motorist yield zone, but it is such an important component of the protected intersection design that's why we continue to stress its importance, because that's what's going to create the space for that motorist to stop and yield. It's the thing that's going to make that bicyclist more visible, essentially positioning the crossing users more in front of the motorist than in more conventional designs. So if we look at this location, for example, from Vancouver, you can see that the turning yellow cab here is looking straight ahead at the crossing pedestrian and would similarly be looking straight ahead if there was a bicyclist in the crossing here. So it really does help to elevate the visibility of crossing vulnerable users to turning motorists. And this, I still love this graphic. We developed this for the MassDOT separated bike lane planning and design guide many moons ago, but really illustrates the difference between conventional designs and protected intersection design. So this is a common issue that we hear with normal conventional bike lanes. When there's a crash between a motorist and a bicyclist, the motorist almost inevitably says they couldn't see the bicyclist. And as you can see in this graphic, even though the bicyclist is right next to them, they're just out of their field of vision, and the motorist really can't see that that through bicyclist. By comparison, a bicyclist that's located in the exact same position as the previous example becomes more visible to that turning motorist as they're navigating a protected intersection. So it really helps to elevate the visibility of those two users. And so when you don't have at least 6 feet of visibility, you end up with that conventional challenge. When you're providing at least 6 to 16.5 foot offset from the edge of the travel lane to the beginning of the bicyclist crossing, that's kind of the sweet spot where research has shown the bicyclist is more visible to the motorist, and that motorist is more likely to yield. And those studies have been for both controlled and uncontrolled intersections. So the same design principles hold true in both of those scenarios. One thing to note here, we say 6 to 16.5 feet, though there may be instances where you choose to go greater than 16.5 feet. And we'll discuss some of those a little bit later when we walk through the checklist, but by and large, that's kind of the zone that you want to be in, 6 to 16.5 feet from the adjacent motor vehicle travel lanes. As I said, yeah, the research clearly showed significant reductions in crashes, better motorist yielding, so it gets us the safety performance that we're expecting. So between the visibility and that increased space, that's what's going to provide us the safety performance that we need at a protected intersection. And then pedestrians are also a very fundamental design user when we think about protected intersections. So when a pedestrian needs to cross the bike lane, in general, they should be provided a pedestrian refuge space that needs to be at least 6 feet wide to meet ADA as a true pedestrian accessible refuge. By providing these refuge spaces, it means that pedestrian exposure is reduced. You're reducing the crossing distance for the pedestrian crossing the motor vehicle lanes by basically breaking up these crossings. They cross the bike lane, they have a refuge, they cross the motor vehicle lanes. If you have streets with on-street parking, providing this pedestrian refuge space should be no problem. You'll have ample space. And then similarly, if you're providing a 6 foot offset of the bike lane, that's going to create the space that you need to create a pedestrian refuge between the motor vehicle lanes and the bike lanes. And then the other design element is the curb ramp, that you still need to provide curb ramps to transition from the sidewalk down to the bike lane, whether the bike lane is at street level or some intermediate level. You still require those curb ramps to create that accessible transition from sidewalk level to another street level. And then again, the same design principles hold true whether we're talking about separated bike lanes or shared use paths. The only difference is you don't have the pedestrian refuge. Instead, you're simply designing curb ramps. And for the shared use path, that curb ramp width needs to at least match the width of that separated bike lane. And I saw a couple comments come in, so it's probably easiest to address them now while we're on these slides.
Yeah, there's one about, is there an ADA guideline published stating it is standard treatment to have the multiple tactical warning strips, meaning it has to be clearly communicated that blind people expecting to push the APS button at the first tactile warning device and then won't be confused when they encounter two other strips. This was a recent SHA question and wanted verification.
So there is guidance that if you're providing a pedestrian refuge, that it at least needs to be 6 feet wide and that it must include the detectable warning surfaces. And let me actually go to the next slide as a good example. So this is a crossing of a bike lane to access a floating bus stop. So this on the right is actually a transit stop. And if you imagine that this was transitioned down to the intersection so that a pedestrian on the sidewalk would be crossing the bike lane to access transit, but also using that same crossing to cross the street, it would be important to clearly communicate to that pedestrian that at this point, you're leaving the sidewalk and about to cross a vehicular lane, in this case, a bike lane, and then similarly having those detectable warnings to communicate that you're crossing a motor vehicle travel lane. So it is an important tool to still communicate to pedestrians that you have reached the edge of a pedestrian space and are about to enter into a vehicular space.
There's two other questions. We can either take them now or we have a Q&A in like 4 slides.
Okay,
Oops.
let's see if maybe I address some of them on these next few slides, and
Okay.
we'll circle back if we don't. So like I said, the detectable warnings are required at the locations of curb ramps and at pedestrian refuges, and that it's important to also mark the crossings of the bikeway with crosswalk markings to show where pedestrians are anticipated to cross, to ensure that bicyclists know that that's a place to expect pedestrians to cross, and that, like any crosswalk, if a pedestrian is in the crosswalk, they need to stop or yield for that pedestrian, and really matches that fundamental principle that we talked about early on of improving the intuitiveness of an intersection to ensure that all users know how they're expected to navigate those spaces. So sort of in summary, all of these elements of protected intersections are going to provide clear paths for users. They're going to provide clear visibility for all users. They're going to define where the queuing spaces are. And, you know, we highlighted the queuing space for motor vehicles, but it's queuing spaces for pedestrians, bicyclists, and motor vehicles are all clearly defined by these design principles. It's going to provide shorter crossing distances, and it's going to control the speeds of users. All of these things really add up to the safest design that you can provide for all the users of the intersection. And while many of the examples we've shown have been sort of idealized, there are going to be many situations where you're designing in a constrained environment, and you will need to manipulate your design to still best achieve these design principles. So in situations where you have a bike lane that's a little closer to the roadway, it's possible to bend out that bike lane, move it away from the adjacent motor vehicle travel lanes to create the geometry of a protected intersection. If you're doing these transitions, the maximum taper is usually a 3-to-1 taper, though it's also common to use the MUTCD guidance of WS squared over 60, where the speed is the speed of the bikeway. The bend in design is something that you will often use if you're trying to maximize space of the sidewalk at the corners. So in a situation where you have a dense pedestrian environment and it's important to prioritize more space for pedestrians waiting at the intersection, it may be appropriate to bend in the bike lane. And as shown on the graphic on the right, you can still create that 6-foot offset at the intersection. You can still create the corner island. It just creates a little more manipulation. One thing to note with the bend-in design is you will often lose the pedestrian refuge space. So as you can see in that graphic, your curb ramp is back at the sidewalk, but you don't have a pedestrian refuge between the bike lane and the motor vehicle lanes. So regardless of which design approach you're taking, you're still getting all of the fundamental design elements of a protected intersection, specifically the corner radius and the things that will control user operations. And so just another example of what this might look like in a constrained environment. This is showing the bend out design. And you can see in these types of situations, it may be appropriate to work with adjacent property owners or a developer of a property to ensure that the pedestrian space is really being thought through. So if you imagine the dashed blue line here is the right of way, it may be appropriate to carve out a little more right of way or to provide dedicated public plaza space to ensure that this corner can be designed accordingly in a more constrained environment. But every situation is going to be unique, and you'll need to think through what's appropriate for your specific intersection and the scope of your overall project. And to that point, the idea of how you handle transitions where perhaps your bike lane is not continuous along the entirety of a corner. So if you're designing a project on the bottom sides of these images, you're designing the separated bike lane, but then that separated bike lane does not continue. In some cases, it may be possible to still provide the receiving protected design on the far side of the intersection and then transition to more conventional designs. In other situations, particularly like smaller developer-led projects, it may not be possible to make these edits at the corner, and as a result, you may need to transition the bike lane, the separated bike lane on the near side, which could be done with the conventional bike box, or maybe it may involve transitioning the bike lane to shared spaces, or simply transitioning the bike lane through the intersection from a protected design to a more conventional design. So again, each situation will be a little different, and your project goals and project scope will inform what you can do on each corner and for the overall project. And then the last thing I'll touch on here is we talked about that protected intersection design can be done through geometry. It can also be accomplished through signal phasing, but many situations will not fully accomplish that goal with full signal separation. So if you can provide signal phase separation, you can remove those conflicts entirely. And there's certain situations where that's completely appropriate, but there's also going to be instances where that's not a viable solution, and we need to carefully assess whether that conflict can occur concurrent. So the table on the right here is showing hourly thresholds for turning motorists, and then what configuration of bike lane you have, what might those volumes of turning motorists be, where you really need to consider phase separation, and in what conditions might it be okay to allow them to move concurrent. And this is also in your checklist, and we'll walk through this in the next section of our presentation. And then also recognizing that there's different ways of controlling how a bicyclist will navigate through an intersection. And I believe Montgomery County has all of these types of situations where you ask a bicyclist to follow a pedestrian signal allowing them to take advantage of things like a pedestrian leading interval where they get a head start into the intersection. And in the case of bicyclists, they'll often clear the intersection before the motorists are allowed to turn. There's the control of the control of bicyclists through the use of conventional signal head, and then there's dedicated bicycle signals with a bicycle signal lens. And again, we'll do a little deeper dive on this in the next section of slides.
Jeremy, on the previous slide, Peter had a question. What is the threshold for signalization? In other words, how many bicyclists?
Yeah, it's not explicit in terms of number of bicyclists. It's more about the number of turning motorists, which then leads to the number of potential conflicts. Certainly, I have dealt with projects in the past where the volumes of bicyclists are expected to remain low for a long period of time, and exceeding these thresholds was considered, but that's going to be part of the decision-making process of filling out the checklist and assessing whether the county is going to be okay with allowing deviation from this chart. But in terms of the county's approach to protected intersection design, this chart will be your guiding principle on how to look at volume separating thresholds for motorists and bicyclists. And I imagine this will be a discussion point on specific projects where you can't fully achieve this.
And then Matt adds, this chart deals with already signalized intersections. I think the question is, when do we need to install a new signal? What is the bike warrant?
And that's going to be really important, especially for things like high volume driveways or locations where you currently have uncontrolled intersections. And most often the real challenge is going to be situations where you have high volumes of left turns. And this may result in situations where you're either deciding to signalize those locations or making the decision to prohibit turns so that these thresholds are no longer relevant. If you prohibit the turns, then you remove the conflicts entirely, push those turning movements to other intersections where they can be better controlled. But again, that's going to be another case-by-case basis for each project to really do a deep dive on these issues to ensure that conflicts are being addressed in the most meaningful way. And then the last slide I had here was just a reminder of bicyclist detection, that when we're talking about protected intersections, detection is often going to be an element that's used, particularly in situations where you have lower volumes of bike traffic. Using bike detection can mean that that signal phase wouldn't be called up unless it's needed, but it does mean that the provision of bicycle detection is often going to be needed at the forward queuing space, at the space before the pedestrian crossing, if this is your configuration of design. And it can also be helpful to provide advanced detection so that bicyclists who are arriving towards the intersection are not being penalized for not already being waiting at the intersection, and to use this as a tool to call the signal and let it know that a bicyclist is approaching, and you should anticipate including that phase for that signal cycle. So just another thing that will have to be thought of during the design process to ensure that the detection and signalization of bicyclists is being considered as part of the design. So that's sort of the broad overview of protected intersections, the fundamental elements and how we approach design. Were there other questions that folks had?
Yeah, just going back a bit, we have a question from Matt. Can you talk about where the APS push button and pedestrian signals should be placed? Essentially, is the bike crossing controlled or uncontrolled? Also, feel free again to raise your hand and we'll unmute you.
Sure. So it's somewhat unique to the location. Montgomery County has some pretty clearly defined recommendations and guidance on the location of accessible push buttons. So for example, if you have a floating bus stop, you would often need the accessible push button in the sidewalk realm as well as in the refuge space, so that a person that gets off of a bus does not have to cross over to the sidewalk to hit the push button. Instead, they just walk down to the pedestrian refuge, hit the push button, and then traverse the intersection. In some situations, as long as you're providing enough time for a pedestrian to cross the entirety of the street, the push button located back at the sidewalk may be all that's necessary. And then I suppose there may be situations where you're considering putting the push button only in the pedestrian refuge and allowing the crossing of the bikeway to be uncontrolled, but that presents some pretty noticeable challenges for people with vision disabilities. So by and large, the approach is going to end up being to put the push button back at the sidewalk, recognizing that some pedestrians are going to cross the bikeway and use the refuge space, but from a pedestrian accessibility perspective, expect that people will cross from the sidewalk realm and cross the street in its entirety.
So we
I
have
hope
two
that
hands
addresses
raised.
your question, Matt.
Well, Matt has his hand up, so let's skip to Matt to see if that's a follow-up. Matt, I think you should be able to unmute.
Yeah, you should be able to hear me, I think.
Yep.
I think you got most of my question answered. Basically what I was kind of getting at is, and I certainly understand the issues with design for people with vision disabilities being one of the critical components here, but we have a situation where in many cases, pedestrians are going to cross to the island and wait, regardless of what the status of the hand is, because the ped signal is, because they can see that there aren't any bikes coming and it's only maybe a 10-foot, 11-foot crossing at the worst case. But we also have situations where bicyclists want to get to that forward queuing area, and cyclists are used to kind of moving up when there's a gap in pedestrians. So, you had the graphic, and there was a question from someone earlier in the chat that was basically like, are cyclists expected to stop at which location? And I think the answer is, if you're approaching and the light's red, you're really under Maryland law supposed to stop before the crosswalk, which means you don't get to use the advanced waiting area. But if we want them to use that advanced waiting area, they need to be able to proceed past the crosswalk when it's clear. We certainly don't want bicyclists barreling through a line of pedestrians crossing the street, but if there's no one crossing, we want them to be able to use that space. And also we kind of expect cyclists to do that, but technically they're breaking the law unless we make it an uncontrolled crossing. And so I think, it's balancing the needs. And then we also have one really unique location in Montgomery County, which we kind of took a mixed approach to, and probably are needing to go back and do some evaluation and determine whether we need to make revisions to that. But at Bethesda and Woodmont, we have a diagonal crossing for bikes because of the Capitol Crescent Trail. This was designed by Tool Design, I should point out. But we also have a situation where, because of the diagonal crossing, we run all the pedestrian signals at the same time. So we have not a barn stance, because you're not allowed to cross diagonally because of the skew of the intersection, but all the crosswalks are on at the same time, and then the bikes cross diagonally, which means if we tried to control those crossings, that bicyclists, when the green bike signal is on to cross diagonally, then they would have to stop at the crosswalks at either end. So it would essentially mean that bikes would have a 3-phase crossing to cross diagonally, which completely eliminates the point of having the diagonal crossing. And so it's a really unique situation where we really want the crosswalks. They kind of have to be uncontrolled. And so I just wanted to maybe a little further discussion on that, because it can be really complicated, but we also have the visually impaired community to plan for, and so we understand those concerns as well.
Yeah, the expectation is that bikes are stopping back here, but will advance forward. And again, if you're allowed to make rights on red, that bike can still legally proceed through that crossing. The issue is going to be when you're dealing with very dense pedestrian environments. If there's constantly pedestrians in the crosswalk, those bicyclists may actually end up being stranded back here, and that this space will still end up being used by bicyclists that are traveling through the intersection and trying to make the left turn. So these are all still important locations for detection, and recognize that just in terms of intersection operations, it will be a little fluid. And yes, you will have people that are proceeding through the intersection, even if they're not legally supposed to be.
Okay, next question. Marguerite, you have your hand raised. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah. Just something that we've noted is usually cyclists at the intersection tend to behave a little bit more like vehicles, which is why we need, right, the turning radii and such for cyclists. And so in a situation of a side path, has there ever been any consideration to possibly splitting the users of the side path at the intersection?
It certainly can be considered, though it creates some real accessibility challenges, because you are then going to have this mixing zone where sorry about that. A pedestrian walking along the sidewalk needs to know that there's a separate space for them that's distinct from the bicycle space. So usually will require some additional detectability cues to allow that to happen. So I've seen it done, but it is a more complex design to
Right.
try and split those users.
So we have a project where we're kind of doing that, and I just wanted to see if you guys had any thoughts on that. That is something we considered for the pedestrians, and so I think what we did was kind of use the change in materials. So we go from asphalt to concrete to kind of let blind people know, hey, you stay on the concrete kind of side of things. And we also use the directional detectable warning surfaces as a way to kind of delineate where the bike ramp was versus where the sidewalk would continue. I just want to make sure that if there were any other considerations that you guys had thought that we were able to kind of incorporate them as well. Thank you.
Marguerite, this is Eli from the planning department. Is your project on Connecticut Avenue by any chance?
No, I'm sorry. It's in Prince George's County in
Oh,
Hyattsville.
interesting. Cool.
Yeah.
Great. We have a
Yeah,
similar
so-
project that does something similar that I think Tool Design actually helped out with the design
I
on
think I did see the
Connecticut
design
at
of
Manor
that.
Road. Yeah.
Yeah, I
So-
think I did see the design of that because you guys probably submitted it to M.SHA, to Jared with the ADA reviews, and he showed it to me because we were working on the same thing kind of
cool.
simultaneously.
Great.
Yeah,
And
so it just started construction. No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, as a quick follow-up, if you look at Capitol Crescent Surface Trail, where it's coming in Bethesda, it's a shared environment, and then it splits into a separated bikeway and a sidewalk crossing, and so there's a level of complexity there too. It's hard to see it because it's not in this photograph, but on the left side of the image, like from the bottom left corner, the trail is coming up, and then there's actually a directional indicator across where the bikeway begins, and there's a change in elevation, and then you have to have a separate pedestrian crossing now of that bikeway. So as Jeremy was saying, it's a lot more complex, not just in like having to split them, but then you have to cross the pedestrians over the bikeway, and it all around just gets a lot more complicated. But it can be done.
And the last question we have is from Andy. Does the bicycle detection work for bikes of all sizes, including kids' bikes?
Yes, with the caveat that it may depend on what type of detection you're using. Sometimes conventional loops aren't going to work as well for certain types of bikes. So carbon bikes with very little metal on them may require a very high level of sensitivity in order for the loop detection to work. By comparison, video detection has been shown very effectively to capture lots of different types and sizes of bicyclists. So the type of detection will be part of that discussion as well.
Thank you. I think that was the last question we have.
All right, great. Well, I jumped ahead in the slides since Matt had brought this up and it was our next slide anyway. So let me turn it over to Megan to just walk through some examples of actual protected intersections.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, so I wanted to share some examples of protected intersections, both from around the county. These are fairly new, but the county already has some really great examples to look to. And then Jeremy will share some from beyond Montgomery County in a little bit. But I wanted to start off with this Capitol Crescent surface trail in Bethesda because it is kind of extremely unique and it's a skewed intersection, which I know a lot of folks are going to be dealing with and have questions about. How does this looks great in the standard graphic that you drew, but how does it apply in this skewed intersection environment? And Tool Design worked with the county on designing this. And there are some unique transitions, and Matt already explained a lot about the phasing and crossing diagonally through the intersection. But something key I wanted to point out here is that all of the elements of the protected intersection, all of the geometric ways we are creating these protected intersections does not change from the standard crossing, from a standard, perfect crossing intersection. We've still got the corner island. You can kind of see, I don't know, Jeremy, if you can like wave your mouse over it on the bottom right of where the two-way comes in. Yeah, and then on the photo, it's pretty clear too. It's like a brick color here. We still have the bicycle crossing. We still have the pedestrian crossing. We have the motor vehicle offset yielding space. We have all of the fundamental elements that we ran through in the beginning of the presentation, they're all still here. They just look a little bit different. So, just a reminder that this can be done in these more difficult intersections. They just take a little bit more thinking through. There are like some really small mountable truck aprons in here, and other elements look a little bit different. But this obtuse angle, how, from going from the right side of the image up towards the top left of the image, that is going to be a more difficult intersection or more difficult turn to control motor vehicle speeds. So it really just reinforces the need to have that protected corner and to have the little truck aprons, and also to provide some signal phasing like nuances that will help allow the crossing to be better protected. So if you want to go over to the next slide. Yeah, so this is Montgomery Ave and Wisconsin Ave in Bethesda. This is still under construction, but something that we've already kind of learned through the process of designing this and seeing it go to construction is that little corner island and mountable truck apron is very small and difficult to construct. And some of the some of the elements of this seem a little more compromised from like ideal, because we're working in this constrained urban environment. And so that's just a trade-off that, as designers and reviewers, you'll need to be prepared to kind of understand the how to achieve the goals of a protected intersection, even when we're in a constrained environment. So you can still see there's still the motorist offset, there's still forward queuing area, there's still the crossings, and there's still the corner island, clear space, all of these elements, even if it doesn't look sort of like an ideal scenario. If you want to go to the next one. So you've seen this picture a bunch already in the presentation, but this is at Spring Street and 2nd Avenue in Silver Spring. The reason I really like this example is that there are multiple bikeway types approaching this intersection. So from in the photo on the right, you can see on the top left approach, there are conventional standard bike lanes that kind of taper into a more buffered or protected bike lane as they approach the protected intersection. You have a pair of one-way separated bike lanes going in either direction across the page, and then a two-way bikeway coming in from the bottom right-hand side of this page. And I think it's just important to remember that the protected intersections can accommodate one-way, they can accommodate two-way, they can accommodate transitioning into a no bikeway or a standard bikeway. And so just overall a really good example of how to implement this at an intersection where there are multiple bikeway types. The other thing is this is a really good example of truck aprons in the county and just how to apply them. You can see the concrete, and this is like kind of opposite of the images that we've shown or the graphics where you have the brick corner island and then more of a concrete truck apron, and that's totally fine because it's visually distinct. It's clear that this is, not an area where you should be driving. It's not an area where you should be queuing. It's meant for driving on. So anyways, you can go to the next one, Jeremy. Okay, so this is probably you're like, what is this? This is not a protected intersection, but I wanted to bring this up and point this out because a lot of elements of a protected intersection are present already in this example. So this could be a good opportunity to think through, like, this is a typical design, but in the future, this could be retrofit into a protected intersection because it's already kind of set up to have a lot of the elements that we've discussed. So for example, you could offset this bicycle crossing back towards the crosswalk a little bit so in the image on the right, bringing it further to the right to create that motor vehicle offset. You already kind of have that buffered area that could act as the corner island and create more of like a wedge for vehicles to turn around or to maneuver around. So there's some elements already, as you can see, that this could be a situation where it might seem tricky, like on the surface, like we have not a very large buffer, but just some strategies maybe to think about and tools to keep in the back of your mind for creating them in a more constrained seeming environment.
And we have lots of other examples that we can look to across the country. If I think back to 2016, there were really only 12 sort of protected intersections that look like these that were built, but now in 2022, there must be hundreds. And if you consider shared use paths or side path intersections to also be protected intersections, we're clearly in the thousands at this point. So lots of designs that we can turn to for examples. But just be aware that Montgomery County is doing some really great work on protected intersection design and clearly addressing pedestrian accessibility. So I would look more towards your local examples if possible. But this was the drawing that Megan was alluding to previously, the idea of extremely large truck aprons. And you might encounter these types of designs in locations where you have two major arterial streets that are intersecting. And for example, if you had a truck on the right side of this intersection trying to make a right turn, if you're not going to allow encroachment and sort of full use of the intersection, you're going to end up needing extremely large truck aprons. So these will be used in some unique locations, but certainly still adaptable to a protected intersection design. And then the most extreme constrained example I can think of is this John Portman cycle track project that we worked on in Atlanta, where this was the first intersection of two-way separated bike lanes in the country in a super dense urban environment. And all we had was enough space for this tiny corner island. It's mostly mountable. So if we have large trucks going through here, they will traverse some of this space. That's also why the stop bars are pulled back and located further away from the intersection. And it doesn't really give us all the queuing space that you would want for bicyclists to navigate through the intersection. All that to say, each location is going to be a little different, and you're going to have to think through all those desire lines and project goals to achieve the overarching benefits of a protected intersection.
All right, welcome back, everyone. So at this point in the training, we're going to go over the protected intersection checklist. As I mentioned at the beginning, completing the checklist will be a requirement of preliminary plan and site plan submittals. The requirement will start with submittals starting on January 1st, 2023, though we certainly encourage you all the private sector folks to use the checklist as soon as possible. That said, we have circulated the checklist among some of you for feedback, and we expect that some minor modifications may be needed over the coming months. I'll turn it back over to Jeremy and Megan. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. So I'm sharing my screen now. I just want to confirm that the transition went okay and everybody can see protected intersection review checklist with the photo. All right, perfect. So now in this part of the training today, we're going to actually dive into the checklist and how to use it, what it is, and answer any questions you have about actually completing that checklist. So I personally am really excited about it. I don't know any other jurisdiction that has created a checklist similar. So as Dave is saying, probably there is going to be some modifications needed at some point, but I think that's really exciting for Montgomery County. So the format of the checklist is really these 4 components, starting with the overall intersection information that you'll fill out one time, the design elements checklist, which goes through each of the elements that we've talked about in entirety in this training. And then there are 2 different sort of resource documents that go along with this checklist. One is this definitions and resources guide, and it directly aligns with the checklist, so you can have that like referencing back and forth. And then the reference graphics, there are 4 different example intersection designs for you to look on. So there's some side paths, there's 2-way bikeways, they're intersecting with no bikeway, there's 1-in-1. So lots of different options for you to reference, as well as all of the tables and figures that we've been talking about throughout this presentation so far. So you don't have to have anything memorized. So in addition to the checklist itself, these design guidance documents are going to be very helpful to have handy when you are completing this checklist. So I would make like a bookmark folder on your desktop or something that has all of these handy. They're all available for free online. You just need to Google them, or you maybe already have access to these links saved. So the information that you're going to need upfront to complete this checklist, obviously you need the street names. Hopefully you have that information in your head, but also who owns the street, what street type is it, what are the proposed bikeway type or types. So for example, in that example I showed in Montgomery County at Spring and Cedar, there was multiple different types. So you're going to need to make sure you have all of that information handy. And then what type of control are you going to have at the intersection? So is it signalized, stop controlled? And then if it is a signalized intersection, you're going to need to have the turning movement counts to help determine whether or not you're going to need to have phase separated bicycle phase. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of terminology that's going to be used in the checklist, I wanted to quickly touch on this. I'm sure most of you already are familiar with bikeway naming types, but so obviously on the left we have no bikeway. That's pretty self-explanatory. And then a conventional bike lane is really just striping. It's space delineation only with a single pavement marking. A buffered bike lane is going to be similar, but it will have a little bit of additional horizontal separation from the motor vehicle travel lane. And a key thing is that it doesn't have any vertical separation. So buffered is just with striping. And then we go into the separated bike lane types. We have 1-way and 2-way. The key difference between this and a buffered is the vertical delineation or vertical separation. So whether that's curb or planters or any other kind of, flex posts, anything that is going to be vertical is going to make this into a separated bike lane. And then finally on the right, we have a side path, which is also, you probably heard this as a shared use path. When we're talking about side path, what that really means is just that it's within the roadways right of way. It's not in its own alignment outside of sort of the rest of the roadway. Okay, so getting into how to use the checklist. So I think everybody has already, I think they put a link to the checklist in the chat. But the first page of the checklist is all of the information about the overall intersection location. So this is just going to be all the basic information that I outlined, like street name, who owns it, what type of street, and this needs to be completed just once for your entire intersection, whether you're just touching one corner or you have a 5-point intersection and you're touching all of them. This just needs to be completed one time. So then there's another section on this page that asks you about the design and control vehicle. So for the typical design vehicle in Montgomery County, you're going to be using a SU-30, and the typical control vehicle is going to be the Montgomery County fire truck. Now, these are the standard for most intersections in Montgomery County, but you want to make sure that you are referencing that Complete Streets Design Guide for additional information, or obviously if it's different and you know it's different, then you can put something else. But just be aware that that may impact some of the other requirements, and just make sure you have the Complete Streets Design Guide available for you to reference and understand what will change. So the checklist was created using the standard design and control vehicle. So then you get into this second section, which is the design elements checklist. So this is a couple of pages and will need to be completed for each corner of the intersection. So whereas the other part that I mentioned, you just do it once for the whole intersection. If you're only touching one corner of an intersection, you only need to complete this once. If you're doing all 4, you will complete it 4 times. It sounds very overwhelming, hopefully not, but we'll walk through how to do that. And there's a lot of information on here that just has additional requirements. So hopefully once you do it a couple of times, it'll be fairly straightforward and simple. So in addition, we have all of these sort of like items in the appendices. We have figures, reference graphics, and tables at the end of the checklist to support your completion of the checklist. So as you work through the one in blue that I showed you, each of one of those letters, like A, B, C, has a corresponding item in the definitions and resources to provide you with additional explanation, additional resources to go to if you have further questions or are confused about anything, so that it's really clear and straightforward. You don't have to fill anything out in the second half of that checklist. It's everything kind of gray colored is just for reference. Again, there are 4 reference graphics of different examples of intersections, and all of these are labeled with letters that correspond to filling out the checklist. So for example, if A is corner island throughout the entire checklist, it's listed that way in the main checklist that you'll be filling out. It's identified in all graphics as A, so that you can kind of see how it plays out in different scenarios. And then again, all of the reference tables and figures that we've been talking about throughout this training are going to be also in the end of that checklist. And so here's just a visual of how it looks. On the right, or I'm sorry, on the left in blue is the actual checklist that you'll be filling out. And you can actually, if you do it online, there are like drop-down boxes, so you can select yes or no or not applicable. And then there's a space to fill out the value next to it if need be. But everything corresponds to the resources really cleanly. So A, B, B. Hopefully it's pretty straightforward. All right, so in the checklist itself, there are multiple columns. The first column where you say ABC, that links you to an image or identifying a location in an image. And then whether or not the things you actually need to fill out are these circled columns. So whether or not the requirement is met, you can select yes, no, or if it isn't applicable, then you can select NA. That's pretty straightforward. Now, there are some items that are going to need you to fill in a value. So for example, for corner radius, the question or the requirement is that the radius of the corner island is set to 15. If it isn't 15, then you need to fill out what the radius is, and then you can provide information in the comments section on the right. So I'm going to go through each of these different elements of the checklist as I work through this. But as you can see, this is just, I wanted to show you that like each of these letters corresponds to a letter in the graphics. Okay, so I feel like everybody is on that page. Do we have any questions or anything about it so far? Can't see the questions.
We just had, and I'll read this, we just had one question from Bob Spalding. Although the protected intersections are a requirement of the bike plan, does the use of these techniques require approval of design exceptions from MCDOT and SHA standard specifications? It looks like Katie Mancarini has responded that, yeah, during regulatory review, we would be looking for Rebecca Torma from MCDOT and Quasi Woodruff from SHA to give approval ideally prior to the planning board approval.
All right.
And I'll just say, I think like, you know, what we're going to get is like regulatory level approvals from those agencies. We'll probably get something in a condition of approval. It's something like, you know, we defer final engineering review at the time of access permit, and that's totally fine. But we do want to key it in during the regulatory process to make sure, at least conceptually, everyone's on board so we can incorporate into a certified set.
Hey, Katie, can you confirm just one thing based on that original comment? They were asking about approvals of design exceptions, which I presume to
design
mean like a
exceptions.
formal design exception. And I would imagine that SHA is not going to require a formal design exception for deviation from Montgomery County's guidance.
That would be my understanding as well. If Quace is here, I can't remember if he accepted. He can speak probably more to that, but that would be my understanding as well. Thank you for that clarification.
So both Quasi and Rebecca are here, and they can unmute themselves if they would like.
Yeah, this is Quasi with SHA. Yeah, Katie, you're right. If it's a Montgomery County roadway, we're not gonna ask for design exceptions.
This is Rebecca Torma from DOT. We don't really do much design exceptions. What we do is we really have to get our traffic engineers and our bike people on board to review and evaluate. So while it's just me coordinating, I'm not making final decisions. So does that help?
Yeah, no,
I think so.
And it's the same here.
Thanks to both of you.
Yeah, it's the same here. Our traffic division and ADA guys get involved. What's in design?
I don't know if we want to take this question now, but Will asks, is there any guidance available for treatments when bikeways need to be terminated at intersections or transition to a different facility type? We can also hold off on that one if you'd like.
Okay. Yeah, we may touch on that in a little bit. So, and I know Jeremy talked a little bit about transitions earlier in the presentation, but if there are further follow-ups, we can always go back to that slide. Okay, so as you're working through this checklist, I was just going to briefly touch again, just for a reminder, what each of the elements are as they correspond to the checklist. So A is corner island, that's this thing. Really, you're just answering, is it present? Yes or no. So it's pretty basic. Then for the corner radius, the default corner radius in Montgomery County is, of course, going to be 15. There are exceptions. Notably, it should be 25 when at least one of the streets is industrial, and it should be 10 when all streets are neighborhood connectors or if they're all yield streets. And again, please see the complete streets for more details and nuance when you're selecting your corner radius. Okay, and then this, the portion on the checklist about the mountable truck apron just asks whether it's necessary based on, your design and control vehicle and what the radius of that is. So the mountable truck apron radius should be set to 15. So that's this out here. Basically, if your corner island cannot be, then you need to create a mountable truck apron that does have a 15-foot radius. And then you would set this curb radii over here, the concrete one, to accommodate your control vehicle. So how that looks when you actually fill the checklist out is let's use this as an example. Does it have a corner island? Is it included in the design plans? You would say, yes, it is. It's right here. For the corner radius, is it set to 15? So no, this is actually 25 feet. So I'm just going to say no, it's 25. If it isn't 15, then you either need to have a mountable truck apron, which is C, or you need to provide explanation in the comments. So maybe that could be your design and control vehicle are different. So that's just a basic on how to fill this out. All right, so then there are requirements for all of these elements that are really referencing the bicycle queuing space. So that's this highlighted over here in D. And so the requirements in the checklist are that the minimum depth of the bicycle queuing space is 6.5 feet, that the width is the width, so like between here and here, over this should match the bikeway width or be wider if you anticipate a higher volume of bicycle traffic. All right, and then E just is basically select which type of bikeways you have, and that is going to be used to inform what your bikeway width should be. And really the bikeway width question is just, is it consistent throughout? Does it meet the standard? And so that's also pretty straightforward. So there is a table in the reference portion of the checklist. So you can always have it really handy. You would use this table to determine what the recommended bikeway width is. And we've clarified, so these are for one-way and these are for two-way. So it's a little tricky because it just says same direction bicyclist and bi-directional bicyclist. But just so you know, this is for one-way and these are for two-way. And then typically side path widths are 10 foot wide or greater as a standard in Montgomery County. So those are the widths that you would enter and be sort of the minimum requirement. All right, and then for any new separated bikeway curb types, so this is within the buffer, or if developers are reinstalling new curb line, all of the new curb should be beveled type B is preferred, and then it is possible in an intermediate, like an intermediate level bikeway situation to use mountable type C. That is allowed. I think we have a couple of questions coming in, but we'll get through these two slides. So for the bicycle stop bar, this is just, is it present and does it meet these minimum requirements? So it should be a 12-inch thick stop bar. It would only cross in the appropriate direction. So for this example, it is correct because it's not over the entrance of the bikes coming in, if that makes sense. So it's only on the approach where you would expect bicycles to stop. It's completely outside of that vehicle travel path. If it were up here, let's say, in the mountable truck apron, that would not meet the requirement since it needs to be outside of the vehicle travel path. And it's also not in conflict with that mountable truck apron. So how that would play out in actually filling out the chart is, is the bicycle queuing space provided? Yes. What is the value of it? What is the minimum depth? In that example we just talked about, it was 6.5. And then going through and, is your bikeway width meeting the minimum? Is your curb type, your new proposed curb meeting those, using those SHA standards? So you're just basically going through and saying like yes or no and providing any additional detail where necessary about the values or adding any commentary where it differs from the Montgomery County standard so that the reviewer looking at this application or looking at this checklist can understand why the design has deviated from, the standard Montgomery County requirements. So do we have any questions about how to fill out for the bicycle queuing space and anything about stop line or width in the
So
questions?
yeah, the only questions we'll punt the one about minimum distance from intersections for street parking for a moment. And then there was a question about or a comment from Matt about the curb type, just as a reminder, those are the curb types on the bikeway side of things. The curb type along the motor vehicle lane should still be normal vertical curbs. And then there's a question of how far back from the intersection is the bicycle stop bar usually set? And essentially the stop bar just needs to be set at a location that's not in conflict with turning motor vehicles. So this is a great image of this, that you have a truck apron in the background of this image. And so you wouldn't be locating the stop bar up adjacent to the edge of motor vehicle lanes, because a bicyclist waiting there would be in the path of a large turning vehicle. So it just needs to be set at a location that doesn't conflict with any motor vehicle traffic.
And I just want to quickly address the private street question. Will these elements also be expected in a private roadway or just public? Just to be clear, a protected intersection isn't a nice add-on for bikeways. It's a vital component of them. So if there is a bikeway on a private street, I think we would expect the vital element of that bikeway to be included. That said, many private streets will only have a bikeway included if it's at the intersection of a public street. So we certainly would require it there.
Great, thanks everyone. So just continuing to work through the checklist, and remember this is being filled out for each approach. So, looking at it, you need to fill it out for this approach, and then at this corner, and then, any other intersection, any other corner approach. So for the clear distance and the motorist yield zone, at this intersection, we are talking about, parallel to the adjacent facility, what is the clear distance? And again, it's looking at that table in the appendix, which I think is on the next slide here, to determine what the appropriate approach clear space. And again, this is not always going to perfectly align with the minimum parking offset or anything like that. This is solely to determine, no trees are in this, nothing is physically blocking, no parked cars are here, for the purpose of the motor vehicle driver and the bicyclist to be able to see each other as they approach the intersection. So those are, two different things on the checklist. We discussed clear distance and we discussed no parking signs and checking the intersection site distance separately.
And so at this point, I'll respond to that other comment that read, the minimum distance for street parking is 35 feet from intersections per the county code. One point of clarification on this is approach clear space is being measured from the point of curvature like we discussed before. The 35-foot requirement is from the intersecting street, so the edge of curb for the intersecting street.
Here.
And so by default, if you are providing the minimum 15-foot radius for the intersection corner and at least the 20-foot approach clear space, which is the smallest allowable amount, 20 feet plus 15 feet equals 35 feet. So as long as you're meeting the 15-foot corner radius and minimum approach clear space, you will also be in compliance with the county's minimum parking offsets from intersecting side streets.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. And then just to touch on the no parking, that is just, making sure, confirming that you've added the stop signs or not stop signs, I'm so sorry, the no parking and no stopping signs where it needs to be restricted out of the clear zone. All right, and then this requirement for the motorist yield zone, again, is to provide 6 to 16.5 feet from the edge of the motor vehicle travelway to the bikeway crossing. And so here's an image example, and then here again are two graphic representations of where you're measuring that 6 to 16.5 feet from. All right,
and Megan, could you just go back that? I mentioned this a little bit earlier. There might be situations where you consider a motorist yielding zone that's deeper than this, so more than 16.5 feet. And that's going to be a case-by-case assessment. But for example, if you have relatively high volumes of left-turning motorists that will be in conflict with these crossings, in those, it might be appropriate to provide at least 20 feet, so essentially 1 car length, so that a left turning motorist is not caught in this conundrum of, I'm going to get T-boned if I yield to the bicyclist or pedestrian. And so it creates a full car vehicle length. But those are going to be very specific situations, and also might be situations where you're considering things like raised crossings for the bike and the pedestrian crossing to ensure that you're still controlling the speeds of motor vehicles. So while these are our recommendations, there may be reasons to deviate from them, but may also come with their own design elements that you should think of.
All right, and then continuing through the checklist, this is just asking, whether or not you've provided pedestrian refuge. If you do provide it, make sure that you have that minimum 6-foot width and the detectable warning surfaces. And so again, this is what we're measuring when we say the 6-foot minimum width to create the pedestrian refuge. If it's narrower than 6 foot, it would not be considered a pedestrian refuge, and therefore you would not want to put the detectable warning surface. And then again, this just needs to be outside of the turning vehicle envelope. And where possible, it's definitely recommended. It also kind of very well aligns with creating that motorist yield zone. It doesn't always. There are situations, obviously, where you could have your crossing offset a bit down here, maybe like in that retrofit example from Montgomery County that I showed earlier. But where possible, this is definitely recommended. And then here, just an image that shows the detectable warning surfaces and how to implement them and provide them. They're typically equal to the width of the crossing where possible. Okay, so moving on to signing and marking in the checklist. This is just making sure that all of the basics are covered in terms of crossing markings, pedestrian crossing markings, bikeway crossing markings, and then green colored pavement where applicable, meeting Montgomery County standards. So here is a detailed image of the Montgomery County standard. It's a high visibility continental style. The travel lane crossing is on the bottom of this, and it's typically no less than 10 feet in width. It's wider. In this example, it's 12 feet. But then at the pedestrian crossing of the bikeway, you typically would use smaller crossing markings just so that it's a little bit more visible, and you can have a few more bars here. So this is an example of the pedestrian crossing of a separated bikeway. As you can see, they are 12-foot markings with 12-foot spacing. They are as wide as the crossing, and this wouldn't be necessary if you have a one-stage crossing or a situation where you don't have a median refuge. You would just use the standard vehicular crossing the whole way across. Okay, and then here is a good reminder that if you have, you're going to want to have the bikeway crossing markings wherever you're connecting to a bikeway facility on the far side. If you don't have a connection to a bikeway facility, let's say you are going from a protected bike lane on one side to a more conventional or just shared lane situation, really, you would not want to provide these bikeway crossing markings. So that's something to note. If they're not applicable, then you don't have to include them. And this is where you would want to transition people either to a shared environment, like on the sidewalk, or on a side path, or into a more conventional bikeway type. And wherever possible, it is ideal to align the pedestrian crosswalk markings and the bikeway crossings as much as possible. So in this scenario, like in a retrofit, we could push that green bikeway crossing closer to the pedestrian crossing, and really that again kind of just helps with creating that motorist yield zone. Okay, and then just to quickly note that there are two styles that you may be using, two styles of crosswalk or bikeway crossing markings. And actually, I guess there are technically 4 because you have 2-way and 1-way. So really the key here is that in Montgomery County owned roadways, you're going to be using 2-foot marking with 4-foot gap. or 4-foot spacing. And then for roadways owned by Maryland SHA, that would be a 3-foot marking with a 3-foot gap. And then typically if it's two-way, you would have your yellow dash center line running through it, and that aligns quite well with the bikeway crossing markings generally. So here's a detail. It's the exact same thing, but in a detail form. Okay, and then green colored pavement is definitely optional, but it is recommended to improve visibility and alert both bicyclists and roadway users, as Jeremy pointed out earlier, that this is a dedicated space for bicyclists and where bikes should be queuing. This isn't a pork chop island that you should drive around. So wherever possible, these are great and recommended, and where they're provided, they should follow the most up-to-date Montgomery County standards. So that kind of covers everything from like a geometric and signing and marking perspective. The checklist then moves on to some signal design considerations, and it asks you to select from one of the bikeway signalization strategies. And we've talked about all of these in the first half of the training, but basically your options to select are you have a bike only signal, or you can use bikes follow pedestrians signal, or bikes can follow just a standard vehicular traffic signal. And I just want to point out that for a two-way bikeway, typically you would not use, for a two-way or in a situation where you have a contraflow bike movement, you would not use the standard vehicular traffic signal because it is typically not visible for that contraflow movement. So you're going to need to make sure you've either signed for a bicyclists to follow the pedestrian signal and that it's visible from their queuing location, or that you've provided a signal dedicated to bicyclists. And the checklist walks you through each of these steps. So you don't need to necessarily remember everything, but basically, you know, is the pedestrian signal head visible from the stop bar? Did you provide the appropriate signage? Did you consider a leading pedestrian interval where appropriate? And so all of these things are listed, and you basically need to say like yes or no, and check the appropriate boxes. So just to touch on these a little bit more, here's an example of a bicycle only signal, and this can be really beneficial in terms of as compared to just having bicyclists follow a pedestrian signal. And the reason is that you can, you know, bikes are faster typically, and so you can provide additional green time as opposed to just having them follow a pedestrian countdown signal where it's timed, you know, for a person walking rather than moving quickly. When you provide this type of signal, you must comply with all of the Maryland MUTCD guidance, as well as the federal highways interim approvals. It also needs to include a no turn on red for any approaches that are going to conflict with the bicycle movement. So for example, if you're using this sign, if you're using the signal, a bike signal with a bike base, you cannot have a conflicting vehicular movement. And that's stated in the FHWA's interim approval. So when you use the bike signal head and the bike signal face, you can only do this when you don't have any conflicting vehicle turns. The other thing is that this cannot be used at pedestrian hybrid beacons. And any kind of deviation from any of those standards in the interim approval would require a request to experiment with federal highway. Okay, another strategy that's common is to have the bikes follow the pedestrian signal. Again, this is just, you know, bikes would use the countdown, and they just need to be able to see the signal head, make sure it's visible from wherever they're queuing at that stop location. And it's also important to consider providing a leading pedestrian interval to allow even more time for them to cross and advance establishment into the intersection. They can also follow a standard traffic signal, but again, this is only appropriate for one-way bikeways, and typically it's the least preferred of the options. All right, and then we did show you a chart a couple of slides back about how to determine whether or not you need to consider a separate a separate bike phase from your vehicular phasing. And so I wanted to just walk through an example of how to fill out the checklist and how to use that chart a little bit more detail, because it's a little bit overwhelming. So this is an example. I just want to caveat all of these examples, the volumes I just made up, they're just for illustrative purposes only. But I think this is a great example of kind of how to walk through this chart. So basically, this is why you're going to need turning movement counts for your for the intersection. So you fill those out on the first page, and then you're just going to, if you're filling it out for this corner, you would input the number of peak hour vehicles per each turn. So how many vehicles are turning right in the peak hour across the bikeway, 102, and then how many are turning left across the bikeway, you have 78. And then input the number of lanes crossed by the left turning vehicles. So you have 2 lanes here that they're crossing. And now the reason that we are caring about how many lanes they're crossing is because the whole concept is they're going to have to judge a gap in traffic. So not only do they have the 2 vehicular lanes, they also will have the bikeway to look to make sure that there's a gap for them to cross. So if you look at the chart, we have a one-way separated bike lane, and we have we have a left turn crossing 2 oncoming lanes. That's left turn, 2 oncoming lanes. So for the left turn, the threshold is 50, that you would want to consider a separate bicycle signal phase. So we've met this threshold here. So when you fill out like, did we meet the threshold? The answer is yes. And so you could provide any explanation about whether or not you are signal phasing or signal separating these movements. And then just to show you a 2-way example, because I know, sorry, I'm moving a little quickly because we're getting tight on time. But again, just inputting the number of peak right turning vehicles and peak left turning vehicles. This one is different because you only have 1 lane being crossed by these left turns. So you use a different column. This is a 2-way separated bike lane and a left turn across 1 oncoming lane. And it's this 146 right turning vehicles that I totally made up would be meeting the threshold for providing a separate signal phase for bicyclists. So again, these are made up. I'm not saying to go change your design. This is just illustrative only. So I just wanted to walk through that. And in the checklist, there is a question, is it recommended? And then is it provided? So I went through that very quickly, but if we have questions about filling out the checklist, we can answer them now.
Well, we got a couple minutes. Any questions? If you raise your hand, we'll unmute you.
Yeah, we tried to make the checklist as intuitive as possible to really walk you through each step of assessment. Hopefully, as you all begin to put this into practice, you will agree, but I can tell you personally, we will be using this checklist internally to be QA, QCing our own designs across the country. So I think it's a pretty powerful tool for verifying that you're meeting all of this design guidance.
As I mentioned, the checklist is currently posted online. We will make sure that the recording of this training as well as the slides are posted online in the next couple of days, and I will send them out to everyone. I am sure questions are going to come up. I would direct you as you're, for the folks from the private sector, as you have questions on specific cases, please direct those to the regulatory team that you're working with, whether it's Katie, Chris Van Alstine, Brett Butler, others that you regularly work with, and they will field questions, and we will, if changes need to be made to the checklist, we'll make those.
And so Robert has a question. Does the signal phasing apply when there's no defined path beyond the intersection? And I think this alludes to the types of designs that we were talking about before, where maybe a developer is only working on one corner and there's no continuous bike path through the intersection. And the completion in the checklist is still a requirement, but the fact that that bikeway does not continue through through the intersection may be the justification for why signal separation is ultimately not proposed, but still something that has to be looked at and completed on the checklist. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and this is Matt Johnson from DOT. I'll just jump in and say that in the intersection that's actually pictured, if you look at the far side, what we don't have bike lanes on that street. That's just a conventional roadway, neighborhood street. But we wanted to make sure that bicyclists were able to traverse the intersection safely. So we created essentially a very short merge lane for bicyclists. And if you're coming in with a development application and you're not crossing the roadway, you have a bike lane, let's say coming up from the bottom right corner, it just ends at the intersection. We're going to want to know what you're going to do for cyclists in the intervening period. That's going to be a question that's going to come up when DOT reviews your plans. And we're going to say, you have this bike lane and it just ends and we're just dumping cyclists into the intersection. That's not acceptable. We need to figure out, like, are we telling them to merge onto the sidewalk? Are we, what are we doing? We're going to need an answer to that question. So, but we would strongly encourage you to try and get the bike lane across the intersection at a minimum, but I know that may not always be feasible, but that's a question that's going to come up when DOT reviews the plans if it doesn't go across the intersection.
And it's definitely going to come up if a development triggers the adequate public facilities ordinance. So if you're generating more than 50 new trips, then the need for offsite improvements is something that's considered as part of that development. So there's going to be certain triggers that I'm sure the county will be evaluating with the overarching goal to provide the safest facility that's within the scope of the project.
Well, I think we're going to bring this to a conclusion now. Jeremy, Megan, thank you so much for this training. And thanks to everyone for your participation. Please let us know if you have questions.
Thanks everybody.
Everyone.